Welcome to this trip through one of the most shocking cases in Mississippi's history. Before we start, please leave a comment with the name of the place you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We'd like to know where and when these documented accounts are getting to people. In the fall of 1843, something strange happened at the Willow Creek Plantation, which is 15 miles east of Natchez, Mississippi. The entry, written in neat handwriting, said that a blind negress, advanced age, limited value slave, had been bought for $30, which was a small amount compared to what slaves usually cost at the time. The price of this sale wasn't what made it interesting. It was the buyer, Edward Langford, a 7-year-old heir to one of Adams County's largest cotton plantations. Records kept in the Mississippi State Archives show that Langford had never been to a slave auction in person before. Colonel William Langford, his father, had been in charge of all these kinds of business matters until he died 3 years ago. There was no official explanation for why Edward made this strange purchase. The plantation's accountant only wrote down that Mr. Langford insisted on doing the deal himself and wouldn't let his overseer help him. Mary Ellen Carter was the name of the woman on the bill of sale. People thought she was between 60 and 70 years old, but there were no birth records to back this up. A merchant from Baton Rouge who had her as payment for a debt said she was useless for fieldwork but knew a lot about herbal remedies. The auctioneer, who later talked to the Adams County Historical Society in 1867, said that the merchant seemed eager to get rid of her. What makes this case so disturbing is the strange coincidence that only came to light after Edward Langford took Mary Ellen to Willow Creek. Reverend Thomas Blackwood, who was the local Presbyterian minister from 1830 to 1851, wrote in his memoirs that Mary Ellen Carter had been a midwife on a nearby plantation 37 years before, right when Edward Langford was born. The summer of 1843 inches Mississippi was very hot and humid. Temperature records from Natchez show that it was over 95 degrees for 23 days in a row in July, and there hadn't been much rain since late May. The cotton stood still in the fields, like it was painted against the cloudy sky. Willow Creek Plantation was built on 2,000 acres of fertile Mississippi land. Colonel William Langford built the main house in 1815. It is on a gentle rise that looks out over the eastern bank of the river. The house had the big columns and wide verandas that are typical of antebellum architecture. However, people noticed that by 1843, the white paint had started to yellow and peel in some places. Edward Langford got the plantation when his father died suddenly of a stroke in 1840. He was the only child left alive. His 3 siblings had all died of different childhood illnesses in the 1820 seconds. Edward Langford's mother, Ella Lanena, wrote in her personal letters that he had always been a strange child. He was quiet, liked to read, and spent a lot of time alone, thinking. Ella Lanena died of consumption in 1839, leaving Edward all alone. There were 14 domestic slaves and a white housekeeper, Mrs. Virginia Pembroke, who was a distant cousin of Ella Lanena's. She came to manage the household after Ella Lanena's health started to get worse. The Virginia Historical Society has Mrs. Pembroke's private letters to her sister in Richmond. In one of them, she says that Edward is a shadow in his own home who takes little interest in the social obligations of his position. Records from the parish show that Edward had never been married, even though he was one of the richest single men in the county. The daughters of nearby plantations had long since stopped expecting to be invited to Willow Creek, and Edward rarely went to the seasonal balls or church picnics that made up the social calendar of Adams County society. Instead, he focused on running the plantation, showing a business sense that even his father didn't have. Edward's leadership led to a 17% rise in Willow Creek's cotton production in just 3 years. People say that life at Willow Creek went on in a very orderly way, with few changes to the way things were done, until Mary Ellen Carter arrived in October 1843. 3 days after Mary Ellen got to Willow Creek, something strange happened for the first time. Edward Langford told the kitchen staff and meal planners that Mary Ellen would not be housed in the slave quarters behind the main house. Instead, she would stay in a small room next to the kitchen in the main house itself. This was the first time this had ever happened at Willow Creek, and it confused both the house slaves and Mrs. Pembroke a lot. On the 23rd of October 1843, Mrs. Pembroke wrote to her sister, "Mr. Langford has put the blind woman in the old sewing room and told her to eat alone. When I asked him why, he said it was a private matter and not to be talked about again. There is something strange about the way he talks about her. Not love, but a strange kind of respect I have never seen in him before." Samuel Jenkins, who was the butler at Willow Creek from 1835 to 1858, remembers that Edward started spending a lot of time with Mary Ellen. In 1865, a reporter from the Natchez Examiner interviewed Jenkins for a series on antebellum states. He said, "Master would sit with that blind woman for hours, just talking in low voices. Nobody was allowed to listen in, and if you came too close, he'd send you away with a harsh word. It wasn't natural-like. She was old enough to be his grandmother and blind as a bat, but he treated her like she was precious." China. Edward kept very detailed daily logs for the plantation, and they show a strange gap during this time. Edward kept careful records of everything else that happened at Willow Creek, but after Mary Ellen's first purchase, there is no record of her anywhere in the official records. It was like she had disappeared from the official records of the estate. Sarah Williams, one of the house slaves who later escaped to Canada and told abolitionist Frederick Douglass about it in 1857, said that other strange things started to happen at Willow Creek around the same time. "Master Edward began to have bad dreams," Williams said. "We would hear him crying out in the night, words that made no sense. The next morning, his sheets would be soaked through with sweat, and there would be deep scratches on his arms, like he'd been clawing at himself while he slept." Williams also remembered that during this time, Edward started to drink a lot, which he had never done before. He would sit alone in his study with a glass in one hand and a book in the other until dawn, but his eyes never seemed to move across the page. Dr. James Montgomery, a doctor in Natchez, visited Willow Creek 3 times in November 1843. The University of Mississippi Medical Archives have the doctor's notes, which say that Edward complained of not being able to sleep, not wanting to eat, and having bad memories of things that happened a long time ago. Dr. Montgomery gave her laudanum and told her to get out of the house and visit family in Charleston. Later entries show that Edward didn't take this advice. Edward started asking questions about his birth around this time. Adams County's parish records show that he asked for access to his baptismal records. Letters found in the family Bible show that he wrote to a number of older relatives asking for more information about the circumstances of his birth. One letter to his Aunt Gertrude Bishop asked directly, "I need to know if anything strange happened around my birth. Mother never talked about it, and Father got mad whenever it came up. What truth are they hiding from me?" Edward's papers after his death did not include a response from Aunt Gertrude. County records show that she made an unplanned trip to Willow Creek in early December 1843, even though it was hard to travel in the winter. She came from her home in Atlanta. She only stayed for 2 days before leaving again, and Mrs. Pembroke's letters say that she left in a state of clear distress. Willow Creek changed on the night of the 7th of December, 1843. The Adams County Historical Society has collected a number of stories from the 1,860 seconds that say a bad thunderstorm hit the area, which was unusual for that time of year. Lightning hit an old oak tree near the main house, splitting it in half and sending a huge branch crashing through the roof of the east wing, right above Edward's bedroom. Samuel Jenkins said, "Master wasn't hurt, thank God, because he had been sleeping in the study most nights. But the next morning, when we were looking at the damage, the blind woman Mary Ellen came out to the oak tree and put her hands on the broken trunk. She said something I couldn't hear, but Master Edward, who was standing nearby, turned white and grabbed her arm so tightly that she screamed. He dragged her back into the house, and we didn't see either of them again that day." No one knows what happened between Edward and Mary Ellen that day behind closed doors, but plantation records show that Edward called his lawyer from Natchez on December 8th and changed his will. The new document, which was filed with the county clerk and made public after Edward's death, had an unusual clause. Mary Ellen Carter would be free and receive a small annuity of $50 a year for the rest of her life. Edward became more and more isolated in the weeks that followed. He stopped checking the fields every day and gave most of his management tasks to his overseer. Kitchen records show that he often asked for his meals to be served in the small room where Mary Ellen lived instead of the dining room, which was the usual place for meals. Mrs. Pembroke was getting more and more worried about how Edward was acting, so she wrote to Dr. Montgomery in early January and asked for another visit. She wrote in this letter, which is still in the doctor's files, "Mr. Langford spends his days in a state of agitation, pacing the halls and muttering to himself. At night, the nightmares continue unabated. When he speaks at all, it is often to ask strange questions about his childhood, particularly his earliest years. Yesterday, I observed him standing before his mother's portrait for nearly an hour, his expression one of accusation rather than grief." Dr. Montgomery's letter in response said to be careful, but it also said that he couldn't do much without the patient's permission. He told Mrs. Pembroke that she could quietly reach out to Edward's closest male relative for help. Mrs. Pembroke wrote to Edward's cousin, Colonel James Langford of Vicksburg, but there is no record of a reply. In late January 1844, something strange happened that was reported in many places. Edward told them to dig up a small part of the family cemetery, specifically the area around the grave of a slave woman who died there in 1806. This was very strange because slave burials usually took place in a different cemetery far away from the family plot. The Adams County Historical Society has testimony from the overseer, John Bradford, saying that Edward didn't give a reason for the request, but insisted that it be carried out right away. There was nothing of interest found during the excavation, and the area was returned to its original state the next day. But later, Sarah Williams remembered that Mary Ellen had been there while they were digging, standing quietly next to Edward with her blind eyes turned toward the ground. Williams said, "I heard the blind woman say, 'It was never there, Edward.' They would have made sure of that after they filled the hole back in." As winter went on, it became harder and harder to understand what was going on between Edward and Mary Ellen. Based on the few reports we have, they talked for a long time, sometimes until late at night. We don't know what these talks were about, but everyone who saw Edward could tell that they had an effect on him. In February, Mrs. Pembroke said he looked gaunt and hollow-eyed, like a man being chased by demons. On the night of the 15th of March, 1844, Edward called Reverend Blackwood to Willow Creek. After his death, the Reverend's journal was given to the Presbyterian Historical Society. In it, he wrote about this visit. Called to Willow Creek at a most unseemly hour by young Mr. Langford. Found him in a state of extreme agitation, demanding that I hear his confession. I reminded him that ours is not a Catholic tradition, but he insisted. What followed was a rambling discourse on incense of the Father and the corruption of bloodlines. Most disturbing was his fixation on the circumstances of his own birth, which he described as tainted by a darkness no man should know. I counseled prayer and reflection, but fear his mind has become unbalanced by solitude and whatever strange notions the blind slave woman has put into his head. There are many accounts of what happened after this visit, but they all agree on the main points. Mrs. Pembroke's last letter to her sister, dated March 17th, says that after the Reverend left, Edward locked himself in his father's old study for a whole day. He called for Mary Ellen to come with him as soon as he got out. They stayed alone together for a few hours, and then Edward called his overseer and told him to get ready for a trip. John Bradford says, "Mr. Langford told me to get the carriage ready for a trip to Natchez the next morning. He said the blind woman, Mary Ellen, would be with him and that I would drive them myself instead of sending the usual driver. When I asked why they were going, he only said that there was a matter of record to be settled at the courthouse." The courthouse records in Natchez show that Edward and Mary Ellen got there around 10 o'clock on March 18. Later, Thomas Wilson, the clerk on duty, told the Adams County Historical Society about their visit. Mr. Langford asked for access to birth records from 1,806, specifically those that recorded slave births at Willow Creek Plantation. This was an unusual request because such records were not usually kept consistently, especially for slaves. I told him that county records were unlikely to have what he was looking for, but he insisted. The blind woman who was with him stayed quiet the whole time, but she held onto his arm with surprising strength. Wilson's statement goes on. After some searching, I found a partial record of births for that year. The entries for Willow Creek were few, but they did note that a slave woman named Sarah gave birth to twins in early May. One of the boys was recorded as stillborn, but the other boy lived. When Mr. Langford heard this information read out loud, he was clearly upset and asked to see the document himself. He asked if any changes or corrections had been made to the record after looking at it. I confirmed that the page showed signs of being erased and rewritten, but this was not unusual in records from that time. At this point, the blind woman spoke for the first time and clearly asked, "Is there mention of a third child?" There was not. We don't know much about what happened on the way back to Willow Creek. Bradford later only remembered that Edward and Mary Ellen were quiet the whole way there. When they got there, Edward went straight to his study and told everyone not to bother him under any circumstances. Multiple witnesses say that Edward's nightmares got worse that night. Several house slaves said they heard him scream so loudly that paintings fell off the walls of nearby rooms. Mrs. Pembroke tried to help, but the door to his study was locked. The screaming stopped by morning. When the door was finally opened around noon the next day, Edward was lying on the floor, unconscious, with an empty bottle of laudanum next to him. They called Dr. Montgomery right away from Natchez. The doctor's notes show that Edward lived through this apparent suicide attempt, but he was unconscious for almost 3 days. Mrs. Pembroke said that when he woke up, he was strangely calm, which was very different from how he had been acting before. He asked for Mary Ellen to be brought to his bedside and for them to have some privacy while they talked. We don't know what happened between them during this last meeting. Plantation records show that Edward Langford officially freed Mary Ellen Carter on the 25th of March, 1844. He gave her manumission papers and a small cottage on the edge of Willow Creek property. At the time, Mississippi law had made it harder and harder for people to be freed from slavery since 1832, so it was unclear if this arrangement was legal. However, no one ever challenged it. Edward also made plans to move his mother's body from the family plot to the chapel cemetery in Natchez, but it's not clear why. This was done in April 1844. There was no marker on the original grave. Edward Langford was in charge of Willow Creek Plantation until 1848, but reports say he never fully got back to being as strong or paying as much attention to detail as he used to. According to plantation production records, things got worse during these years, and by 1847, Edward had sold off almost 500 acres of land. Mary Ellen Carter lived in the cottage that was given to her until she died in November 1849. Local records show that Edward came to see her often during this time, and he often brought a doctor to help her as she got weaker. Only Edward and Reverend Blackwood were at her funeral. Reverend Blackwood wrote in his journal, "Laid to rest, the woman called Mary Ellen today. Langford insisted on a proper Christian burial and a headstone with her name on it, which is unusual for someone of her station. During the short service, he stood still as a board, and his face showed no emotion, except when I said the line, 'Ashes to ashes.' At this, he flinched, as if he had been hit." Edward Langford sold Willow Creek Plantation to a businessman from New Orleans 3 months after Mary Ellen died. He then left Mississippi. County records show that he bought a small piece of land near Charleston, South Carolina, where he lived mostly alone until he died in 1856 at the age of 50. The main mystery in this story is what link existed between Edward Langford and Mary Ellen Carter, and what horrible truth they found out about his birth. A strange document found while the Willow Creek main house was being renovated in 1869, though, gives us a hint. When workers took out damaged floorboards in what used to be Colonel William Langford's study, they found a hidden compartment with a leather-bound journal inside. The Mississippi Department of Archives and History now has the journal, which looks like it belonged to Elelonena Langford. Most of the entries are about everyday household chores, but a series of entries from April and May of 1806 paints a scary picture. These entries say that Elelonena, who had lost several babies in the past, really wanted a child. Colonel Langford came up with a way to help his wife when a slave woman on the plantation gave birth to healthy twin boys in early May. Ella Yanena was still recovering from another failed pregnancy. One of the twins would take the place of their stillborn child and be raised as their own son and heir. To keep Sarah, the slave mother, quiet, they were going to tell her that both of her children had died. They made plans to sell her to a plantation in Louisiana as soon as she got better. The only other person who knew about the lie was the midwife who helped with the birth, who was probably Mary Ellen Carter, though the journal never names her. Ella Yanena says that the midwife was paid to keep quiet and stayed at Willow Creek where she could be watched. The last entry about this issue, dated the 20th of May 1806, says, "William has decided that more precautions are needed. The midwife's eyes are to be put out, which is sad but necessary to protect our son's future. She will be told it is punishment for stealing, and no one will question it. William assures me she will still be useful in the herb garden, and her silence is now doubly assured, as who would believe the word of a blind slave against that of the master? I pray for forgiveness even as I recognize the necessity of these actions." There is no more mention of Sarah or the midwife in the journal, but later entries carefully track Edward's growth, as if the mother really cared about her child. We don't know how Mary Ellen Carter showed up again at the slave auction in Natchez in 1843, or how Edward came to think he knew the truth about his past. It's just as strange that he sought her out instead of completely ignoring the connection. Some historians think that Mary Ellen may have set up her own sale, maybe because she knew Edward's name when she found out who was buying slaves in the area. There is a strange footnote in the records of the Adams County Historical Society about this case. In 1867, when they were going through the things that had been taken from Edward's Charleston home after he died, they found a small wooden box with a lock of hair tied with a faded ribbon. There was a yellowed note with the hair that only had the name Sarah and the date the 4th of May, 1806 on it. We don't know how Edward got this keepsake from his birth mother, if that's what it was. As the Civil War and its aftermath changed the society that made Edward Langford and Mary Ellen Carter, their case became less well known. During Reconstruction, Willow Creek Plantation was split up and sold in pieces. The main house burned down in 1876, taking with it any secrets that were still inside its walls. There isn't much left today to show that Edward Langford or Mary Ellen Carter ever lived. The simple inscriptions on their graves, which are hundreds of miles apart, don't say anything about their shared history. Mary Ellen's last home, a cottage, was taken down for wood a long time ago, and the exact location has been lost to time and the growing forest. But there are still pieces of their story in Mississippi's archives and historical collections. A bill of sale, a new will, a doctor's notes, a hidden journal, pieces of a puzzle that may never be fully put together. In the fall of 1843, a plantation owner bought a blind slave woman at auction. This made him face a truth about himself and his family that almost destroyed him. The most terrifying thing about this case is the question that still haunts those long talks between Edward and Mary Ellen. Did she feel bad about her part in the lie that changed his life, or did she just tell him what she saw the night he was born? That night, when she was blind and broken, she saved his life twice. Once by bringing him safely into the world, and again by letting him live a life of privilege that was never meant to be his. The plantation house at Willow Creek is long gone, but people who live nearby say that on some nights, when the air is thick with humidity and the cicadas suddenly stop making noise, they can hear a man's anguished scream echoing across the old grounds. Some people said they saw a woman walking slowly along the overgrown path where Mary Ellen's cottage used to be. Her hands were outstretched in front of her, as if she were trying to find her way through the darkness. A professor from the University of Mississippi tried to find records of the slave Sarah in 1869. He wanted to find out what happened to Edward's biological mother after she was sold to Louisiana. He only found one entry in the ledger of a plantation near Baton Rouge. It said that a female slave with that name died in December 1806, just 7 months after being separated from her children. The cause of death was melancholia, leading to refusal of nourishment. No one has ever found any trace of Sarah's other son, Edward's twin, who was recorded as stillborn but may have lived. The story of Edward Langford and Mary Ellen Carter shows us that some parts of American history are purposely hidden from view, buried under layers of lies and silence. But even these hidden threads can come back to light generations later, showing patterns that the people who made them never meant to be seen. Maybe the worst part of this case isn't the physical abuse or the personal betrayals, which were awful, but the fact that even the most carefully planned lies can't stand the test of time. The past that has been buried will come back to haunt those who inherit it, making them face truths they never thought they would have to and question the very core of who they are. Edward Langford chose to face this truth in the end, instead of living the lie that had shaped his life. Only he, and maybe the blind woman who helped him see the truth about his birth, know if this choice brought him peace in his last years. The records from Charleston County, from 1856 to 1857, have an interesting addition to this story. Edward Langford did a number of strange things in the months leading up to his death that suggest he was still very concerned about where he came from. Charleston's Second Bank's records show that Edward took out a lot of money in January 1856 and hired a private investigator from New Orleans named James Kavanaugh, who used to be a police officer. Kavanaugh's office found letters after his death in 1862 that show Edward had asked him to find any living relatives of a slave woman named Sarah who had been sold from Willow Creek Plantation to Louisiana in 1806. The Louisiana Historical Society now has Kavanaugh's notes, which show that he carefully searched through plantation records in 3 parishes. In his last report to Edward, which was dated March 1856, he made a shocking discovery. A male slave named Isaiah, who was about 50 years old, was listed at the Bellwood Plantation near Opelousas, Louisiana. Records showed that he had been bought as a baby in 1806 from a slave trader in Baton Rouge who had gotten him from a plantation in Mississippi. Isaiah had a unique birthmark on his left shoulder that was exactly like one that Ella Lenana Langford had written about in her journal on Edward's body. It is not clear if Edward ever did anything with this information. In April 1856, his health got worse very quickly, and by May, he was bedridden. Edward often talked about a brother lost, and asked the doctor many times if he could see the resemblance. According to Dr. William Harrison's medical journal from the last weeks of his life, the last change to Edward's will, which he wrote just 3 days before he died, is probably the most moving document related to this case. He told his trustee, Edward's lawyer Harold Green, to put a large part of his remaining wealth in trust and use it to buy the freedom of a slave named Isaiah from Bellwood Plantation, if such man still lives. He also told Green to give Isaiah a house in a free state and an annuity that would allow him to live comfortably. Green's personal diary, which he gave to the South Carolina Historical Society in 1879, tells the story of how he tried to carry out this strange gift. He went to Opelousas in August 1856, but when he got there, he found out that Bellwood Plantation had been sold the year before, and that many of its slaves, including Isaiah, had been sold to different people. Green couldn't find Isaiah, even though he hired local agents and put ads in several newspapers. Green's last note on the subject, dated October 1858, said, "I have exhausted all reasonable avenues in the search for the man called Isaiah, as directed by my late client, Mr. Langford. With great reluctance, I must now declare this search unsuccessful. As per the terms of the will, I have therefore directed the funds intended for this purpose to be donated to the Society of Friends' efforts to assist fugitive slaves in reaching safety. I believe this alternative would meet with Mr. Langford's approval, as it may help others in circumstances similar to those of the man he sought. What connection existed between Mr. Langford and this slave remains a mystery to me, though I confess the intensity of his concern has led me to certain speculations which, out of respect for the deceased, I will not commit to paper." The story could have ended there, lost in the dusty archives of antebellum history, but an abolitionist named Martha Simmons wrote about a strange meeting she had in 1859. Simmons, who ran a station on the Underground Railroad in Cincinnati, wrote in her diary about meeting an old escaped slave who came through her house in February of that year. Isaiah was the name of the man who was trying to get to Canada. Simmons says that Isaiah ran away from a plantation in northern Louisiana after finding out that his master wanted to sell him to someone in the South. While he was at the Simmons home, he told them bits and pieces of his life story, including the fact that he thought he had been born a twin but had been separated from his brother when they were babies. Most interestingly, he talked about a dream he had over and over again in which he went into a big house with white columns and saw a woman he thought was his mother hugging him and another boy who looked just like him. Simmons, who had read newspaper articles about Edward Langford's strange will, was surprised by the coincidence, but didn't tell Isaiah about it because he was afraid it would make him want to look into it more and risk his freedom. Her diary only says that she gave him food, clothes, and directions to the next station on his way north. There are no other historical documents that tell us what happened to Isaiah. It is still not known if he made it to Canada and freedom, if he ever found out about his possible connection to Edward Langford, or if he was really Edward's twin brother. Like many stories from this sad time in American history, the full truth is hidden under layers of official records that treat people as property instead of people with their own histories and connections. In the 1,880 seconds, the Willow Creek plantation site became part of a bigger farming operation. By the early 1900s, not many people in the area remembered the Langford name. The family cemetery where Ella Lenana Langford was buried became overgrown and neglected, and the headstones slowly sank into the soft Mississippi soil. Workers building a new county road in 1927 found what looked like the remains of a small building near the old plantation boundaries. Local newspapers report that several items were found in the foundation, including a tarnished silver thimble, pieces of a clay pipe, and, most interestingly, a small glass bottle with dried herbs and roots inside. A botanist from Jackson said that the herbs were ones that slave midwives used to help with difficult births. Some people thought that the ruins might have been Mary Ellen Carter's cottage, but there was no solid proof to back up this idea. The Adams County Historical Society first showed the artifacts, but they went missing during a renovation in the 1,950 seconds. No one knows where they are right now. The Langford Carter case garnered renewed academic interest in the 1,970 seconds as historians began to reevaluate plantation records from the perspective of African American experiences. In 1976, historian Claudia Jefferson published a detailed study of Ella Lenana Langford's journal. She showed how the plantation system affected the minds of everyone involved, even the white women who were often complicit in its cruelty. Jefferson's research revealed further context concerning midwives such as Mary Ellen Carter. Plantation records from all over the South showed how these women were in a strange situation. They were valued for their skills in keeping both white and enslaved children alive, but they could be severely punished if they were seen as threatening the social order in any way. The intentional blinding of a slave midwife was not an isolated incident in the Langford case. Analogous occurrences were documented on a minimum of 3 other plantations in Mississippi and Louisiana from 1,800 to 1,820. Jefferson contended that what set Mary Ellen's case apart was her seemingly deliberate choice, decades later, to instigate a confrontation with the child whose birth had caused her anguish. It is uncertain whether Edward Langford was driven by a desire for revenge or reconciliation, but the fact that he not only bought her but also set her free indicates that their relationship was more complicated than mere revenge would suggest. Jefferson found a strange document in the Mississippi Department of Health's archives that had gone unnoticed before. A Register of Negroes Practiced in Medicine from 1823. It had a listing for a blind woman named Mary who was known for being very good at treating fevers and digestive problems on 3 nearby plantations near Natchez. The register said that she had been taught African ways along with European ones and was allowed to travel between properties. This was a rare privilege for an enslaved person, especially one with a disability. This finding suggested that Mary Ellen had built a reputation that went beyond Willow Creek, which may explain why she was sold to a merchant in Baton Rouge instead of staying on the Langford plantation after Ella Lenana's death. It also showed that she had some freedom, which was unusual for an enslaved woman. This raises the possibility that her return to the Natchez auction in 1843 was planned. In 1992, renovations to the old courthouse in Charleston uncovered a hidden compartment in what had once been Harold Greene's office. This was the last piece of the historical puzzle. There was a sealed packet of papers inside, with instructions that said it should be destroyed when Greene died. For some reason, his orders had not been followed, and the packet had been hidden for more than 100 years. The South Carolina Historical Society now has the papers. They include a letter from Edward Langford to Greene that was written 2 days before Edward died. The letter was written with shaky handwriting and gave clear instructions on how to find Isaiah, including a description of the birthmark that would set him apart. But the last paragraph gave me a new perspective on why Edward did what he did. "You have been a loyal friend and advisor, Harold, so I will tell you the truth that has haunted me for the last few years. Isaiah is not just a distant relative or the child of someone I owe money to, as I previously led you to believe. He is my brother by blood, my twin, born of the same mother, on the same day. We were separated by an act of unspeakable cruelty, planned by those I once called father and mother. He was raised in chains while I enjoyed every privilege. The woman who told me this truth, Mary Ellen Carter, showed me more compassion in her blindness than my supposed parents did with their sight. She could have sought revenge for the suffering they caused her, but instead she offered understanding. I cannot undo the injustice that shaped both our lives, but perhaps I can give Isaiah the freedom and comfort that should have been his birthright. This is not charity, Harold, but the repayment of a debt that can never truly be settled. Historians are still arguing about what the Langford-Carter case really means. Some see it mainly as an example of how deeply immoral the slave system was, since it allowed people to steal not only work, but also their identity and family ties. Some people focus on how strong Mary Ellen was when she survived being blinded on purpose and decades of slavery before finally facing the truth on her own terms. The psychological horror at the story's core is undeniable. It goes beyond physical violence to include the existential dread of realizing that everything you think you know about yourself is based on lies. Edward Langford, the privileged heir who learned he was born a slave, was shocked by this news because it changed not only how he saw his place in society, but also how he saw himself. No one will ever know everything that Edward and Mary Ellen talked about in private at Willow Creek. Did she tell him about the moment he was born? And the first time she held him? Did she tell him about his mother, Sarah? How she looked, how she sounded, and how she cried when she found out her sons were dead? Did she say how she knew it was Edward at the auction because of a small detail that had stayed the same over the 37 years since she last saw him? There are no clear answers to these questions, but they show how close people can be even when they are very different from each other. Mary Ellen Carter, an elderly blind woman deemed so valueless that she was sold for $30, possessed information that disrupted the life of one of Mississippi's wealthiest young planters. Their improbable connection reveals a profound truth about American history that transcends any single plantation or family. The unavoidable interdependence of lives that slavery sought to classify as wholly distinct and unequal. The land where Willow Creek Plantation used to be is now part of a national forest. There is nothing left to remember Edward Langford, Mary Ellen Carter, Sarah, or Isaiah by, but their story lives on, a quiet counterpoint to the official histories that for a long time hid the complicated realities of life in the South before the Civil War. The best epitaph for this case might come from a source that doesn't seem to be related to it. In 1861, an anonymous poem called The Midwife was published in the abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator. There is no proof that the author knew Mary Ellen Carter, but some of the lines suggest that they did. The last stanza says, "She who brings forth life into the light, though darkness be her portion and her right, sees truth that masters miss with perfect sight, and waits for justice with a patient might." It is up to history to decide if Edward Langford and Mary Ellen Carter ever got justice. Their intertwined fates serve as a compelling reminder that even the most meticulously upheld systems of oppression cannot inhibit the formation of human connections across their boundaries. Connections that occasionally, against all odds, foster a degree of truth and reconciliation.